Fascist. Ever since Donald Trump pulled into the lead in the 2016 Republican primaries, he's been called a fascist. This is the favored political curse word of the American left. It's nothing new. Nixon was called a fascist. Reagan was called a fascist. George W. Bush was called a fascist. I've been called a fascist, and if you oppose the left-wing political agenda, so have you. Sure, any outspoken conservative is called a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, an Islamophobe, a xenophobe. But since all of those words have clear meanings, they're easily disputed. The fallback is fascist. Try to pin that word down. It conjures visions of Hitler and Mussolini and who else? Franco? The word itself means a bundle of sticks and represents the power of collective thought and action over individualism. But nobody who's ever called you a fascist will be able to explain what they mean when they use it against you. It's an accusation thrown every second of every day in the U.S., but even the best definitions are pretty vague. In 1944, George Orwell took a stab at it. Quote, "As used, the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. Yet underneath the mess, there does lie a kind of buried meaning. The people who recklessly fling the word fascist in every direction attach, at any rate, an emotional significance to it. By fascism, they mean, roughly speaking, something cruel, unscrupulous, arrogant, obscurantist, anti-liberal, and anti-working class. Except for the relatively small number of fascist sympathizers, almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much-abused word has come." Close quote. Liberal is used here in the classical sense, and obscurantist means withholding knowledge from the public. I'd say that Orwell was giving a pretty good description of the Democratic Party and their propagandists throughout Trump's term, but especially as COVID-19 gave them the ultimate election year power lever. Their talent for projection really is next level. COVID-19 began in 2019, as the number in its name implies, but in the U.S. we couldn't be bothered at first. 2020 was an election year. We were divided as never before by the ideological battle represented by Donald Trump on one side and a clown car full of lefties on the other. If you peeled back the onion, the fight was really between American exceptionalism on the one hand, and on the other our gradual submersion into the one-world collective that lives in the minds of all determined progressives. As COVID hit New York like a sucker punch, the way forward became obvious to Trump's most vigorous enemies. At daily briefings by the Coronavirus Task Force, a visual of the greater struggle appeared. In the red corner, the hated world champion, Donald Trump. And in the blue corner, Dr. Anthony Fauci, a welterweight health agency bureaucrat who'd been around since the AIDS epidemic. Political tribalism loves binaries. It loves reductionist thinking. To every blue governor watching the daily briefings, there were just two men on that stage. One big and showy, one compact and modest. One long-winded, one brief. One who embodied American swing-for-the-bleachers optimism, and one who viewed everything through the cautious, slow-focusing lens of international medical consensus. One was Trump, one was the anti-Trump. In a nutshell, Anthony Fauci told us what our moms had told us when we were 5 years old and the flu was going around. Wash your hands a lot and don't let anybody cough in your mouth. It was determined that we would all stay home voluntarily for 15 days in order to slow the spread of COVID-19. The blue governors, most of whom hoped to be president someday, soon realized that they could make the voluntary mandatory. They took to those 15 days like a crackhead takes to 15 hits on the pipe. They liked it, this new form of power. They wanted more. They extended the voluntary house arrest indefinitely, and then they decided which businesses were essential and kicked the rest to the curb. As always, Orwell nodded sadly from beyond the grave. Bullies indeed. Unless your gathering directly served the anti-Trump narrative like the George Floyd Festival of Rioting did, your gathering was outlawed. And all of this was supposedly in keeping with the dictates of Anthony Fauci. In fact, Fauci had been a figurehead all along. It wasn't until rank-and-file Democrats started making masks at home and wearing them everywhere that Fauci finally wore one himself. By then, he was just trying to keep up. But he served a purpose. Each new restriction was directly legitimized by Fauci's gospel of social distancing. Fauci just went along for the ride, a hero at last. Soon the black mask became a sort of facial yarmulke. The constant repetition of stay at home was like a call to prayer. Millions of masked lefties went out to the front lawn to post a BLM placard like lamb's blood on the doorpost so the angel of death might pass them by. As the pandemic wore on, it all became ceremonial. Demonstrations every day supposedly aimed at an invisible force called systemic racism, but actually performed as a litmus test. If you knelt down before the mob and were absolved, the collective embraced you. If you performed the COVID rituals to a T, sacrificing your job, your business, your art, and everything that gave your life meaning, you were good. If you walked freely in the open air, fully identifiable by your features, you were bad. Through any historical lens, this all looked an awful lot like the citizen cops and snitches that spring up every time totalitarianism gets its legs under it. Over time, Fauci came to represent a simple concept, that only grim collectivist sacrifice was capable of defeating the great pandemic. On and on it dragged, not a battle, but a siege. Nobody in California had any hope of this letting up before November 3rd. Another half year has passed since then, and we're about 75% open. From the start, Trump had been optimistic and proactive. He challenged health officials and captains of industry alike. Why can't Ford and GM whip us up some ventilators? Why are we waiting for the Chinese-controlled supply chain to make us a few billion masks? Why not do it ourselves, starting yesterday? Are there drugs that are cheap and effective and already on the shelves that might nip coronavirus in the bud? Why on earth should a vaccine take 2 or 3 years to produce? Hello, we're America. Let's kick some ass here. It's no mystery why Trump's optimism was rejected. It was rejected because it reeked of American exceptionalism, free market ingenuity, and the power of the individual. It's no mystery why open discussions of therapeutics like ivermectin were censored from social media. Obscurantism, plain and simple. Perhaps if Donald Trump had stood firmly against these alternative protocols, tens of thousands of deaths could have been prevented. But he didn't stand against them, and so his haters had to. That's how tribal binaries work. Between the emergency powers grabbed up by blue states and the power of race bullying to quash opposition, Democrats cohered as never before in my lifetime. Still today, with most of my state vaccinated and new COVID cases so rare as to seem quaint, many of my neighbors cling to their masks, even when pruning the shrubs with no other human within 50 yards. It's a statement of ideological purity having nothing at all to do with the pandemic that barely touched our little hillside town, even at its peak. These neighbors are saying, "We are the bundle of sticks that cannot be broken. We are one mind. We serve one vision. We are the volunteer thought snitches and language cops, and the black mask is our badge of authority." They are saying, "We will never forget the glorious revolution of 2020 when we rose up over tens of millions of Zoom connections to smite down the orange terror, to reestablish the doomy worldview that drives us ever onward to the place where finally the caprices of individualism are conquered once and for all. We are the FAUCISts." Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel and then click the little bell to get notifications.